The train lurched to a stop at Norfolk, Virginia, and for the first time in 6 weeks, the doors slid open. Fresh air rushed into the freight car, carrying with it the scent of salt water and something else. Something the men inside couldn't quite identify at first. It was the smell of a country untouched by war. Oberleutnant Hans Müller tried to stand, but his legs had forgotten how. He'd weighed 210 pounds when he enlisted in the Wehrmacht in 1940, a strapping example of German efficiency and physical culture. Now, in July 1943, he weighed 128 pounds. His uniform hung on him like a burial shroud. His gums bled when he breathed, his vision blurred in anything less than full daylight. And he expected, at any moment, for the Americans to exact their revenge. The hands that reached in to help him weren't rough. They were surprisingly gentle. An American medic, wearing a uniform so clean it looked fresh from the factory, supported Müller's weight as his feet touched American soil for the first time. "Easy there, buddy," the medic said in English. Müller didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was concern. This wasn't supposed to happen. For months, Nazi propaganda had prepared them for what American captivity would mean. The mongrel nation, they'd been told, the decadent society of criminals and weaklings, would show no mercy to representatives of the master race. Torture was expected. Starvation was certain. Death was probable. Instead, Müller found himself being helped onto a stretcher, found himself being carried toward a line of vehicles that gleamed in the summer sun, found himself, against everything he'd been taught for the past decade, being treated like a human being. The revelation was so profound, so completely contrary to everything his indoctrination had promised, that for a moment, Müller thought he might be hallucinating. The scurvy had done that to some of his comrades, conjuring visions that weren't there. But the stretcher beneath him felt real. The worried expression on the American medic's face looked genuine. And when they loaded him into what he would later learn was called an ambulance, the shock of finding actual medical equipment, actual supplies, actual evidence of concern for his welfare hit him with the force of an artillery shell. This was the beginning of a transformation that would affect not just Hans Müller, but 425,000 German prisoners of war who would pass through American camps between 1943 and 1946. It was a transformation that would challenge everything they believed about their enemies, about their own ideology, and ultimately about the nature of human dignity itself. The story of German POWs in America is one of the most remarkable and least known chapters of World War II. It's a story of men who arrived as walking skeletons and left as healthy humans, of prisoners who expected death and found mercy, of an experiment in humanity that would have profound implications for the post-war world. And it's a story that begins not in America, but in the burning sands of North Africa, where the German war machine encountered something it couldn't overcome: basic human biology. In February 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps represented everything the Nazi regime wanted the world to believe about German military superiority. Mechanized, disciplined, seemingly invincible, these elite troops pushed the British to the edge of defeat in North Africa. The Desert Fox, as Rommel was known, appeared capable of achieving what seemed impossible, conquering terrain that had defeated armies for millennia. But there was a problem, one that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Every gallon of fuel, every round of ammunition, every can of food had to be shipped across the Mediterranean Sea. And the British weren't making that easy. By late 1942, half of all supply ships bound for North Africa never reached their destinations. British submarines and aircraft hunted the supply convoys with ruthless efficiency. By early 1943, the figure had climbed to 70%. 70% of everything the Afrika Korps needed to function simply vanished into the Mediterranean depths. The soldiers didn't starve all at once. Starvation is a process, not an event. It happens in stages, each one marking another step toward complete physiological collapse. First came the reduction in physical performance. Men who could march 20 miles found themselves struggling to manage 10. The body, deprived of adequate calories, began conserving energy. Non-essential functions started shutting down. Muscle mass, built up through years of military training, began to dissolve as the body consumed itself for fuel. Then came the mental changes. Irritability spread through the ranks like a virus. Men who had been brothers in arms found themselves snapping at each other over trivialities. Concentration became difficult. Orders that would have been executed instantly now required repetition, explanation, sometimes threats. The obsession with food became all-consuming. Conversations that once focused on tactics, on home, on the progress of the war, narrowed to a single topic: what they'd eaten, what they might eat, what they remembered eating before the war. Food became the center of their universe. Then came the visible alterations. Weight loss that turned strong men into scarecrows. The hollow-eyed look of malnutrition. Skin that seemed to hang from bones instead of covering muscle. Uniforms that fit properly, now billowing around frames that had lost 30, 40, sometimes 50 pounds. And then came the diseases of deficiency, arriving one by one like the four horsemen of a very specific apocalypse. Scurvy appeared first. Vitamin C deficiency. The gums began to bleed. Old wounds, long healed, spontaneously reopened. Teeth loosened in their sockets. Bruises appeared across the skin without any trauma to explain them. Men became too weak to fight, then too weak to march, then too weak to stand. British sailors in the 18th century had called scurvy the plague of the sea. The Afrika Korps soldiers, surrounded by sand instead of water, found it equally merciless. Then came the night blindness, vitamin A deficiency. As dusk fell, men with perfect vision in daylight found themselves effectively blind. Night operations became impossible. Sentries couldn't see attackers, drivers couldn't navigate. The tactical advantage shifted dramatically toward forces with adequate nutrition, forces that could operate after dark. Beriberi followed. Thiamine deficiency. The nervous system began to fail. Some men developed wet beriberi, characterized by swelling in the legs and fluid in the lungs, leading inexorably to heart failure. Others developed dry beriberi, numbness in the extremities, muscle weakness, eventually paralysis. Both types killed slowly and painfully. Pellagra came last, but hit hardest. Niacin deficiency, the 4Ds, as medical officers called it. Dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, death. Skin lesions that burned in the desert sun, intestinal problems that turned eating into agony, mental confusion that made soldiers forget their own names, and finally, inevitably, death. By the time of the Kasserine Pass engagement in February 1943, 40% of Afrika Korps soldiers showed symptoms of at least one deficiency disease. By the time of the German surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, that number had climbed to 70%. The vaunted German military machine, the supposed superior Aryan warriors, had been defeated not by enemy tactics, but by basic human biology. You can't fight on an empty stomach, no matter how convinced you are of your racial superiority. You can't march without vitamins. You can't maintain discipline when your body is consuming itself for fuel. When the Americans finally captured these men, they weren't capturing soldiers. They were inheriting the victims of one of the greatest logistical failures in modern military history. And the Americans, to the shock of everyone involved, decided to save them. The crossing took 6 weeks. 6 weeks aboard Liberty ships that had delivered American troops to the war and now returned home with cargo no one had anticipated. German prisoners of war. Thousands of them packed into holds designed for supplies, heading toward a country most had never expected to see. The ships risked being sunk by their own U-boats, an irony not lost. By the end of World War II, 425,000 German prisoners of war had been interned in the United States. 425,000. That number bears repeating because it represents one of the largest movements of prisoners in modern history. To house them, the United States constructed 700 camps across the country. Not all were permanent facilities. Many were temporary branches of larger base camps, established for a few months to provide labor during harvest season or construction projects. But whether permanent or temporary, they all operated under the same basic principle: strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. Every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont housed German POWs at some point during the war. California had 106 camps, the most of any state. Texas came in second with 80. The South housed the majority of camps, partly because the warm climate reduced heating costs, but also because that's where agricultural labor was most desperately needed. The camps came in different classifications. Base camps were large, permanent facilities capable of housing thousands of prisoners. Branch camps were smaller, often housing just a few hundred men, usually located near specific work sites. Segregation camps were special facilities where hardcore Nazis were separated from other prisoners after it became clear that intimidation and violence were being used to maintain ideological control. The logistics of housing 425,000 enemy soldiers on American soil were staggering. Each prisoner needed housing equivalent to what American soldiers received. Barracks had to be built, mess halls established, medical facilities equipped, recreational areas created. Gower towers went up, barbed wire fences were erected, administrative buildings were constructed to handle the paperwork of processing, feeding, and managing hundreds of thousands of men. And all of this had to be done while the nation was simultaneously mobilizing for total war on 2 fronts. The expense was enormous, but there was a calculation behind it, one that went beyond simple humanitarian concern. The United States held these men, but Germany held American soldiers. How America treated German prisoners would likely influence how Germany treated American prisoners. Reciprocity wasn't just policy, it was strategy. Colonel A.M. Tollefson, assistant director of the POW division, explained it clearly when responding to protests about the good treatment of German prisoners. America intended to play by the rules, he said, to avoid giving even the semblance of an excuse to the enemy to violate the rights of American soldiers whom they hold as prisoners of war. But strategy alone doesn't explain what happened in these camps, because what happened went beyond the minimum requirements of the Geneva Convention. What happened was something closer to rehabilitation. The first step was medical. When Major Robert Harrison, a physician with 16 years in the Army Medical Corps, stood on the platform at Camp Shelby, Mississippi in July 1943, he thought he'd seen everything. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, the particular horror of gas gangrene, but nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for what shuffled off the train that sweltering afternoon. Before him stood what remained of Rommel's Africa Corps, and they looked like photographs from concentration camps. Harrison later wrote in a medical journal article that the condition of arriving prisoners represented the most severe cases of nutritional deficiency he had encountered in his entire career. These weren't wounded soldiers. They were victims of systematic starvation.
The numbers were stark. Average weight on arrival, 132 pounds. For men whose pre-war weight had averaged 175 pounds, this represented a catastrophic loss of body mass. Some prisoners had lost 30% of their body weight. Some had lost 40%. A few had lost nearly half their mass and somehow remained alive. Harrison established a protocol that would be replicated across the camp system. Every arriving prisoner received a complete medical examination. Weight, height, blood pressure, temperature, all recorded meticulously. Wounds were inspected, infections were cataloged, symptoms of deficiency diseases were documented. The most common findings were predictable, given the circumstances. Scurvy affected 92% of arrivals. Beriberi was found in 63%, pellagra in 48%, night blindness in 37%. Many prisoners suffered from multiple conditions simultaneously. Treatment began immediately. Not in a few days, not after paperwork was processed, immediately. Prisoners too weak to walk were placed on stretchers and carried to hospital wards. Those with infected wounds were taken directly to surgery. Men showing signs of severe malnutrition were put on therapeutic nutrition programs designed by the best medical minds available. The approach was systematic. Small, frequent meals rather than large ones. High-calorie foods balanced with vitamin supplements. Fresh fruit for vitamin C, liver for vitamin A, whole grains for B vitamins. The diet was carefully calibrated to provide maximum nutrition without overwhelming digestive systems that had forgotten how to process real food. The results were remarkable. Average weight gain in the first month, 8 to 10 pounds per prisoner. In the second month, 10 to 12 pounds. By 3 months, prisoners had gained an average of 25 to 30 pounds. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real transformation was visible in faces that filled out, in skin that regained color, in eyes that could focus again. Prisoner testimonials documented the shock of recovery. One prisoner, whose name was recorded only as HB in medical records, described the experience. When I was captured, I weighed 58 kilograms. After 2 years as an American POW, I weighed 84 kilograms. I had gotten so fat you could no longer see my eyes. The statement was meant for humor, but it captured a profound truth. These men were being restored not just to health, but to a physical condition better than they had experienced in the German military. Medical care extended beyond nutrition. Infections were treated with penicillin, a wonder drug that German forces simply didn't have in sufficient quantities. Dental problems, widespread after months of scurvy, were addressed by American military dentists. Mental health, though not understood in 1943 the way it is today, was at least acknowledged through recreation programs designed to combat depression and boredom. The recovery rate from scurvy was 98% within 6 weeks of vitamin C supplementation. Night blindness resolved in 95% of cases within 7 to 8 weeks of proper nutrition. Even beriberi, which had seemed intractable, improved in 87% of cases within 8 to 10 weeks. These weren't just statistics to the men experiencing them. These were lives being saved by an enemy that had every reason to be vengeful and chose mercy instead. The psychological impact of this care was profound. Everything these men had been taught about American inferiority, about the weakness of democratic societies, about the superiority of the Nazi system, was being challenged by the simple act of being fed and healed. Some prisoners tried to rationalize it. The Americans were fattening them up for propaganda purposes, or to extract information, or to use them as bargaining chips. But these explanations became harder to maintain as weeks turned to months and the care continued without any apparent ulterior motive. The truth was simpler and more challenging to Nazi ideology than any propaganda could have been. The Americans were treating them well because American values demanded it. Human dignity wasn't contingent on race or nationality. It was inherent. This was a lesson that would echo far beyond the camps. The routine at Camp Concordia in Kansas was typical of POW facilities across the United States. Reveille at 6 in the morning, roll call at 6:30, breakfast at 7, work details departing at 8 for those assigned to labor. For those remaining in camp, a day filled with structured activities designed to maintain morale and prevent boredom. The barracks themselves would have been familiar to any American soldier. Wooden buildings, each housing 30 to 40 men, with individual bunks, footlockers for personal belongings, adequate heating in winter, and ventilation in summer. Officers received private rooms, as stipulated by the Geneva Convention. Enlisted men shared quarters, but the space allotted per prisoner was equivalent to what American soldiers received. Mess halls were served 3 times daily in mess halls that looked identical to those used by American troops. And the food was, as per Geneva Convention requirement, the same as what American soldiers ate. This provision created one of the great ironies of the war. German prisoners in America ate better than German soldiers fighting in Europe. They ate better than German civilians back home. And they often ate better than they had ever eaten in their lives. Breakfast might include scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter, milk, and coffee. Lunch could be roast beef, mashed potatoes, vegetables, bread, and dessert. Dinner offered similar variety. Prisoners who had lived on wormy bread and rancid oil couldn't believe what they were being served. At first, many prisoners burned leftover food, convinced that if they didn't finish their portions, rations would be reduced. It took weeks for them to understand that there was no shortage, that the food would keep coming regardless of how much they consumed. Beer was available for enlisted men at camp canteens, wine for officers. The canteens sold cigarettes, candy, reading materials, playing cards, and other items prisoners could purchase with the wages they earned from work assignments. Wages. That concept alone challenged everything prisoners expected. Under Geneva Convention rules, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, but they had to be paid. Officers could not.
It began with a newspaper. Der Ruf, which translates to The Call, was edited by sympathetic German prisoners and distributed throughout the camp system. On the surface, it appeared to be a simple prison newspaper covering sports, cultural events, and news from home. But embedded in its content were democratic ideals, subtle criticisms of Nazi ideology, and articles about American history and values. The newspaper was enormously popular. Prisoners hungry for reading material and news from the outside world consumed every issue. And whether they realized it or not, they were absorbing ideas that contradicted everything they'd been taught. Libraries became tools of re-education. The books provided weren't random. They were carefully selected works that, while not overtly political, promoted humanistic values and challenged authoritarian thinking. German classics that had been banned by the Nazis, American literature that portrayed democratic ideals, historical works that told stories of freedom and individual rights. Movie nights were instituted. Prisoners watched American films, ostensibly for entertainment. But the films chosen showed American life, American values, American prosperity. They showed a diverse society functioning successfully, a direct contradiction to Nazi racial theories. After VE Day, when the war in Europe ended, the program became more overt. Rapid courses on democracy were offered to cooperative prisoners. American history was taught. The benefits of free markets, free speech, and free elections were explained. Discussions were held about the differences between authoritarian and democratic governance. Not all prisoners were receptive. Hardcore Nazis, separated into segregation camps, maintained their ideology despite everything they saw. These men intimidated fellow prisoners, sometimes violently, to maintain ideological purity. They held secret courts, trying and executing prisoners they deemed traitors to the Nazi cause. 14 of these men were eventually hanged at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, for murdering fellow prisoners. But the hardcore Nazis were a minority. Most prisoners, confronted daily with evidence that contradicted Nazi propaganda, began to question what they'd been taught. The transformation wasn't always immediate or complete. Some prisoners remained conflicted, caught between years of indoctrination and the reality of their treatment. Others pragmatically accepted that Germany had lost and democratic ideas might be useful in rebuilding. But many experienced genuine conversion. They came to believe that the democratic values their captors represented weren't weakness but strength, that respect for human dignity wasn't naive but fundamental, that a society built on equality and freedom could be more powerful than one built on hierarchy and force.
An exit poll of 22,153 POWs conducted at the end of the war showed that 74% left the United States with a favorable attitude toward democracy and their American captors. 74%. One prisoner, cited as Herr Funk in Associated Press accounts, corresponded with 80 fellow prisoners after returning to Germany. He reported that among his correspondents, reeducation had not been necessary. They had become convinced Democrats simply through their treatment. This might be the most remarkable outcome of the entire POW program. America didn't just house enemy soldiers, it transformed many of them into advocates for the values America represented. The program wasn't perfect. Many prisoners were more concerned about their families in devastated Germany than about political ideology. Some rejected democratic ideas entirely. Others paid lip service without genuine belief. But enough were genuinely transformed that when Germany needed to rebuild after the war, there was a cadre of men who had seen democracy in action and believed in its principles. Some of these former POWs went on to become prominent in post-war Germany, carrying with them the lessons learned behind American barbed wire. The experiment in re-education was, by most measures, successful. Not because it was cleverly designed or forcefully implemented, but because it was backed by the simple power of treating people with dignity. Ideas are most convincing when they're demonstrated rather than preached, and the United States demonstrated its ideals every day in how it treated its prisoners. Oberleutnant Friedrich Bauer kept a journal during his time at Camp Shelby. The entries, written in German on paper provided by the camp library, traced a psychological journey that thousands of prisoners experienced. August 3, 1943. I'm gaining weight. This should make me happy, but instead I feel angry. Where was this food 6 months ago? Why did my men have to die of scurvy when treatment was this simple? We were told the Allies had no resources, that they were on the brink of collapse, yet they have enough to feed their prisoners better than we fed ourselves. The anger in that entry is palpable. Bauer had been a medical officer in the Africa Corps. He'd watched men die of diseases he knew how to treat but lacked the resources to cure. The discovery that those resources existed, that the Allies had them in abundance, challenged everything he'd believed about German superiority and Allied weakness. August 17, 1943. Dr. Patterson asked me today about German military hospitals. I told him about the shortages. No antibiotics, inadequate anesthetics, surgeries performed without proper sterilization because we lacked supplies. He seemed genuinely shocked. He thought we were rationing for the war effort. I had to explain there was no rationing. There simply wasn't enough of anything. The war consumed resources faster than they could be produced. Germany makes so much that they can waste medicines on prisoners. Germany makes so little that our own soldiers die for lack of basic supplies. This entry captures the moment of recognition, the instant when propaganda collapsed under the weight of reality. Bauer had believed in German efficiency, in the superiority of the Nazi system. Confronting the evidence that American productivity dwarfed German capabilities forced a reevaluation of everything. September 7, 1943. A new group arrived today from Sicily. They look, as I must have looked 3 months ago, walking corpses. One man asked if he was being taken to an extermination camp. He'd heard rumors about what Germans do to prisoners. When I explained he'd receive medical treatment and 3 meals a day, he laughed. He thought I was mocking him. Tomorrow, when he wakes up for breakfast, he'll understand. I wonder how long it will take him to question everything he believed, as I have. The recognition that his own transformation could be replicated in others marked another stage in Bauer's evolution. He could see now that Nazi ideology wasn't an immutable truth, but a construct that collapsed when confronted with contradictory evidence. September 23, 1943. I realized today that I have not thought about the Führer in weeks. This shocked me. For 10 years, Hitler was the center of German life. His face on every wall, his voice on every radio, his ideology shaping every thought. Here in this American camp, he is simply absent, not mocked, not condemned, just irrelevant. And I find that I do not miss him. I miss Germany, I miss my family, but I do not miss the regime. When did that change? This entry represents perhaps the most profound transformation. The absence of Hitler wasn't just political, it was psychological. For a man who had spent a decade in a system where the Führer was omnipresent, discovering he could live without that presence was liberating and terrifying in equal measure. Bauer's journal continued for the duration of his internment, each entry marking another step away from Nazi ideology and towards something else. Not uncritical embrace of America, but a genuine questioning of the assumptions he'd held since joining the Hitler Youth as a teenager. His transformation wasn't unique. Throughout the camp system, similar evolutions were occurring. Some happened quickly, catalyzed by a single moment of recognition. Others developed slowly, resistance gradually eroding under the accumulated weight of contradictions between expectation and reality. The process was aided by time. Unlike prisoners in active war zones, POWs in America had time to think, to read, to talk with fellow prisoners and with Americans. Time to notice that the mongrel society they'd been taught to despise functioned better than the pure society they'd been taught to revere. Discussion groups formed organically. Prisoners debated what they'd experienced, what it meant for Germany's future, what kind of country they wanted to rebuild. Not all agreed. Some clung to Nazi ideology. Some embraced democratic ideals enthusiastically. Most fell somewhere in between, uncertain but open to new ideas. The Americans facilitated these discussions without directing them. The Special Projects Division provided materials but didn't force conclusions. The strategy was to expose prisoners to alternatives and trust that intelligent men, given access to information, would reach reasonable conclusions. Christmas 1944 at Camp Shelby brought these transformations into sharp relief. A year and a half after Bauer's arrival, prisoners gathered for holiday celebrations that would have been impossible in the early days of their captivity. The special meal was better than most Christmas dinners Bauer had had in peacetime Germany. Turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, vegetables, pie for dessert. Prisoners ate in mess halls decorated with small Christmas trees and homemade ornaments. Feldfebel Kurt Miller, who'd arrived with Bauer and recovered from protein deficiency edema that had swollen his legs to twice their normal size, raised his coffee cup in a toast. To our American captors, who feed us better than our own commanders did. The laughter that followed was bitter but genuine. The comparison cut deep because it was true. These men had suffered under a system they taught to believe was superior. They'd been rescued by a system they taught to despise. The cognitive dissonance couldn't be maintained indefinitely. Something had to give. For many prisoners, what gave was their faith in Nazi ideology. Not all conversions were sincere. Some prisoners pragmatically recognized that Germany had lost, and adjusting their beliefs to align with the victors made sense. Others remained committed Nazis, but hid their beliefs to avoid being separated into segregation camps. But many transformations were genuine. These men had seen, with their own eyes, that democratic values weren't weakness, but strength. That respect for human dignity wasn't naive, but fundamental.
Today, few Americans know that 425,000 German prisoners spent the war in the United States. The camps have been demolished, their land repurposed. The barracks at Camp Hearn in Texas became the site of a school. Camp Mexia became a facility for the mentally disabled. Camp Swift was divided between housing developments and a prison. The physical traces have largely vanished, but the human traces remain. About 860 German POWs remain buried in 43 sites across the United States, their graves often tended by local German women's clubs. Men who died of illness or accident during captivity, buried far from home in a country they'd arrived in as enemies. The camp cemeteries are quiet places now, visited occasionally by descendants of prisoners or by historians researching this forgotten chapter. The graves are marked with simple headstones, maintained according to international agreements about war dead. But most prisoners returned home, carrying with them experiences that shaped the rest of their lives, and in aggregate, helped shape post-war Germany. The American POW program has been called many things by historians: an experiment in democracy, a successful rehabilitation effort, a strategic calculation about how to treat enemy soldiers. All these descriptions are accurate, but perhaps the most accurate description is the simplest one, voiced by the prisoners themselves. They called it heaven on earth, and they meant it.
Not literally, not without irony, but with genuine appreciation for treatment they'd never expected to receive. The contrast between expectation and reality was so profound that it challenged everything they'd been taught. They'd expected brutality and received care. They'd expected starvation and received abundance. They expected hatred and received, if not friendship, at least respect. This contrast created cognitive dissonance that demanded resolution. Either American behavior had to be reframed as somehow sinister, or Nazi propaganda had to be recognized as false. Most prisoners, confronted with daily evidence of American decency, chose the latter. The transformation wasn't always complete or permanent. Some prisoners returned to Germany and reverted to old beliefs. Others remained conflicted, never fully resolving the tension between what they'd been taught and what they'd experienced. But enough were genuinely transformed that the impact on post-war Germany was significant. These men became voters, community leaders, businessmen, politicians. They carried with them the memory of an alternative to authoritarianism, a memory that influenced their choices about Germany's future. The United States, for its part, benefited from treating prisoners well. The Geneva Convention compliance protected American soldiers in German hands. The labor program filled crucial gaps in the wartime economy. The reeducation effort helped create a pool of Germans sympathetic to democratic values who would be useful in rebuilding Europe. But beyond these practical benefits, the POW program represented something important about American values. The United States had the power to treat prisoners cruelly and chose not to. It had the resources to provide minimal care and chose to provide excellent care. It could have warehoused enemy soldiers and instead invested in rehabilitation. These choices cost money and effort. They were criticized by some Americans who wanted harsher treatment for the enemy. They were complicated to implement during a total war that strained every resource. But the choices were made, and they mattered. Not just for the prisoners who benefited directly, but for what they demonstrated about the relationship between values and power. A nation powerful enough to defeat its enemies, but principled enough to treat them humanely. A system confident enough in its ideals to expose prisoners to them without fear. A culture that valued human dignity even when dealing with those who denied it to others. This was the real victory of the American POW program. Not the practical benefits, though those were significant, but the demonstration that democracy's strength came not from force, but from the values it embodied. The prisoners who arrived expecting brutality and received mercy carried that lesson home. Some forgot it, some denied it, but many remembered. And in remembering, helped build a different future. The camps are gone now. The barracks demolished. The barbed wire rolled up and recycled. The guards and prisoners alike have mostly passed into history. But the story remains. A story of what happens when enemies are treated with dignity, of how small acts of mercy can challenge deeply held beliefs, of the power of demonstrating values rather than merely proclaiming them. It's a story worth remembering, especially in an age when the treatment of prisoners and enemies remains contentious. The American POW program wasn't perfect. Mistakes were made. Some prisoners suffered. Some Americans protested that the enemy was being treated too well. But by the measure that matters most, the program succeeded. It took men who'd been indoctrinated in hatred and gave them a reason to question that indoctrination. It took prisoners who expected death and gave them life. It took enemies and, in many cases, created friends. This is the forgotten chapter of World War II. The story of 425,000 German prisoners who came to America expecting hell and found something closer to heaven, who arrived as believers in Nazi ideology and left many of them as convinced Democrats, who experienced firsthand that the strength of democracy lies not in its ability to crush enemies, but in its commitment to human dignity. They called it heaven on earth, those German prisoners in American camps. And while that description might seem hyperbolic, consider what they'd experienced before arriving. Consider the starvation, the disease, the systematic failure of the system they'd been taught to believe in. Consider their expectations of torture and cruelty. And then consider what they found instead. Medical care that saved lives, food that restored bodies, treatment that respected dignity, an enemy that chose mercy when revenge would have been easier. In that context, heaven on earth doesn't seem so hyperbolic. It seems like an accurate description of the transformation from expected death to unexpected life, from anticipated cruelty to surprising kindness, from propaganda about American barbarism to reality of American humanity. This was the gift America gave its prisoners, intentionally or not. Not just food and shelter and medical care, though these were vital, but the gift of disillusionment, the precious gift of having lies exposed and truth revealed. For men who'd been lied to their entire lives about the nature of democracy, about the weakness of diverse societies, about the superiority of authoritarian rule, the experience of American captivity was profoundly educational. It taught them, more effectively than any propaganda could, that they'd been deceived. And in learning that lesson, in experiencing the reality that contradicted the propaganda, many of these prisoners became the seeds of a new Germany, a democratic Germany, a Germany built on values learned not in classrooms, but in POW camps, where enemies demonstrated through their actions what their ideals meant. This is why the story matters. Not for nostalgia or patriotic pride, though there's room for both, but as a reminder that how we treat our enemies defines who we are as surely as how we treat our friends. That values mean nothing if they're abandoned when dealing with those we have power over. That the true test of principle comes not when it's easy, but when it's hard. The German prisoners in American camps were tested, and many changed. But America was tested too, and chose mercy over revenge, rehabilitation over punishment, humanity over hatred. Both sides were transformed by the experience, and in their transformation lies a lesson for every age that grapples with how to treat those we have defeated, those we have power over, those we could crush, but might instead choose to save.